Welcome to Justice Reloaded HD, where we believe that even the smallest act of kindness can echo across a lifetime. Let me ask you something simple, yet powerful. Can a single hug change everything? Not just for the one being held, but for the one who dares to hold on? Today's story doesn't begin with grand gestures or heroic speeches. It begins quietly, with a waitress kneeling beside a little girl who couldn't speak, couldn't walk, and yet could feel everything. What followed wasn't just a moment of compassion. It was a shift, in the heart of a father who thought love had no place in science. In the life of a woman who once gave up her dreams. And in the silent world of a child who finally found comfort in a stranger's arms. If you believe that a hug at the right moment can break through fear, silence, and even pain, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Because every week, we share stories of quiet courage. Stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that sometimes, love doesn't need words. The sun cast a soft amber glow over the quiet town of Burlington, Vermont. Along the still waters of the lake, tucked beside a grove of maple trees just starting to turn gold for fall, sat a small diner with faded red awnings and creaky wooden steps. It wasn't the kind of place billionaires visited. But that Tuesday, a Rolls-Royce pulled into the gravel lot and parked silently by the fence. Edward Monroe stepped out, dressed in a dark gray suit that hadn't wrinkled since he left New York. At 62, his face was carved with sharp, disciplined lines, the kind that rarely softened. A widowed giant of the biomedical world, Edward didn't believe in sentimentality. He believed in data, in progress, in systems. He had spent decades engineering devices that helped paralyzed children walk and terminal patients speak. But his own daughter, Grace, remained a mystery science couldn't solve. He opened the back door of the car and gently lifted the frail, silent figure curled beneath a soft blanket. 7-year-old Grace didn't speak. She couldn't sit up without help. Her body had learned to fear loud sounds and sudden motion. Her small fingers clutched a frayed cloth doll that had lost one eye and most of its stuffing. Still, she held it like it was her lifeline. Edward didn't ask why. He carried her into the diner, nodding briefly to a hostess who looked too nervous to speak. The lunch crowd was modest, retirees by the windows, a young mother feeding a toddler, a pair of nurses on break. The kind of calm Edward calculated would be safe for Grace. He placed her gently into a booster seat lined with towels he had brought himself, adjusted the straps, and handed her the doll. Then, his phone buzzed. "I'll be right over here," he whispered, stepping toward the window, already pressing the device to his ear. Business never waited. Behind him, something shifted. A crash. Not loud but sharp enough. A tray of cutlery had slipped off a counter in the kitchen, clattering onto the floor. It wasn't near their table, but the noise traveled fast. Grace stiffened instantly. Her fingers opened. The doll dropped to the linoleum. Her shoulders began to tremble. No sound came from her lips, but her eyes widened with alarm, and her whole body seemed to recoil inward, folding into itself like a leaf under frost. From across the room, Janelle Brooks had seen it all. She had been moving between tables, balancing 2 iced teas and a plate of grilled cheese, when she noticed the child start to shake. She saw the father's back turned. She saw the other customers glance, then quickly look away. No one moved. She didn't think. She just acted. Setting the drinks on an empty table, she slipped off her apron and crouched beside the girl. Her knees touched the tile. She didn't reach for the doll, not yet. She looked at the child first. Grace's breaths were rapid and shallow, her arms curled tight against her chest. Janelle said nothing. Words wouldn't help. Instead, she opened her arms, slowly, deliberately, and gathered the girl into them. No rush. No fear. Just stillness. Her hands rested lightly along Grace's back. Her chin gently touched the child's soft, tangled hair. She didn't pat, didn't rock, didn't shush. She simply held. And Grace, for the first time since the noise, stopped trembling. It was subtle, a shift barely visible to anyone not watching closely. But Janelle felt it. The muscles eased. The girl's shoulders dropped. Her breath steadied. Grace leaned in. From the window, Edward turned just in time to see it. He froze. At first, his instinct was to step forward, to intervene, but something in him made him stay. Because what he was seeing didn't compute. He had hired 7 trained professionals, flown in from across the country. Therapists, nurses, behavior specialists. None had gotten that close to Grace without her resisting. None had been able to calm her without charts and sedation protocols. Yet here was a waitress, a stranger, on her knees beside his daughter, doing what none of them could. And Grace was still. Janelle didn't move. Her arms formed a quiet shelter around Grace, not squeezing, not swaying, just existing. Her chin rested gently atop the girl's tangled curls, the warmth of her breath rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. She understood instinctively that Grace didn't need noise. She didn't need questions or comforting words. What she needed was presence. Stillness. Safety. So that's what Janelle gave her. There, in the middle of the diner floor, time seemed to pause. Plates clinked in the background, a spoon stirred coffee somewhere near the counter, but Janelle heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to this child in her arms, a child who had been frozen in fear, lost in a storm of sound and sensation, and who now somehow was beginning to come back. Grace's tiny shoulders, once rigid and trembling, began to loosen. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough for her breaths to come slower. Enough for her fingers, curled tightly against her chest, to uncurl just slightly. And then it happened. The left hand, so often limp and unresponsive, shifted. Just a few inches. Just enough for the fingertips to brush lightly against the fabric of Janelle's uniform, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. But to Janelle, it felt like an earthquake. She didn't speak. Didn't react with a gasp or a smile. She simply allowed the touch to land, allowed Grace the choice to explore, to connect, on her own terms. And Grace stayed. Nestled in the quiet hollow beneath Janelle's collarbone, she remained still. Not stiff, not tense, but still in the way that only someone who has finally stopped running can be. From the window, Edward watched. His call had long ended. The phone was in his hand, forgotten. His body had turned toward the table the moment he'd seen the waitress kneel, but now, he couldn't move. His breath caught somewhere between disbelief and awe. This scene made no sense. He had spent years trying to soothe his daughter's fears. He'd flown in experts from top pediatric clinics, funded personalized therapy programs, installed sensory-controlled environments in their home. And yet, in every one of those sessions, Grace had recoiled. She had cried, screamed, gone stiff like a board when someone tried to hold her. But now here, in the arms of a stranger who hadn't said a word, Grace had not only calmed, she had reached out. Edward's eyes narrowed as if he were analyzing a glitch in a system he'd designed. But there was no algorithm to explain what he was seeing. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't science. It was something else entirely. He walked back toward the table, slowly, as if approaching a sacred scene he didn't want to disrupt. He stopped a few steps away, watching the gentle rise and fall of Grace's back against Janelle's chest. He noticed the way Janelle breathed in sync with her, not forcing, not guiding, just matching. Meeting the child where she was. And for the first time in a very long time, Edward didn't feel like a father managing a condition. He felt like a father witnessing a miracle. He cleared his throat softly, not to interrupt, but because his own breath had caught in his throat. Janelle looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear in her gaze, no apology. Only a calm, quiet question in her expression. Is this okay? Edward didn't speak. Couldn't. His throat tightened. He simply nodded, once. And Grace remained still. The next day, the same diner by the lake welcomed a familiar car, not the sleek black town car driven by a chauffeur, but Edward Monroe's own sedan. For the first time in months, he hadn't scheduled a therapy session, hadn't arranged for a specialist or nurse to be present. He simply got behind the wheel and drove his daughter back to the place where, just yesterday, something had shifted. Grace sat beside him in the back seat, buckled carefully with her doll cradled gently in her lap, though the stuffing had begun to leak and a seam along the side had split wide open. Edward had noticed the tear that morning and made a mental note to order a new one. But then he stopped himself. This wasn't just a doll. This was her doll, the one she refused to let go of, even during her episodes. As he pulled into the gravel lot again, something in Edward's chest stirred, not anxiety, not dread, but a quiet anticipation. He wasn't sure what he expected. All he knew was that he had to come back. Inside, the diner was nearly the same as before. The midday sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting warm patterns across the linoleum floor. An elderly couple sat at the corner booth, and the same waitress with a soft ponytail moved gracefully between tables. Grace was quiet as he carried her inside, but her eyes moved, wide and searching, scanning the room with a flicker of urgency. Then, in a flash, she saw her. Janelle. She was near the register, wiping down a menu with a damp cloth. The moment their eyes met, Grace's entire face changed. Not drastically, just a slight widening of her gaze, a soft, unmistakable lift at the corners of her mouth. Her grip on the doll loosened. Edward noticed. He followed her line of sight and saw Janelle, who had paused mid-wipe, as if she, too, felt the electricity in the air. She approached slowly, not wanting to overwhelm, but unable to stop the gentle smile forming on her lips. In her hand, she held something wrapped in a paper napkin. "She dropped this yesterday," Janelle said softly, kneeling beside Grace once more. Her voice was steady, kind. She unwrapped the napkin to reveal the small cloth doll, but something was different. The seam had been mended. Carefully, by hand. The stitches were uneven but firm, the same shade of pink thread running neatly across the side where the stuffing had been escaping. Janelle held it out with both hands, not placing it in Grace's lap, but offering it, an invitation, not an expectation. "I thought she might miss it," she added, her voice even gentler now. Grace didn't reach out right away. But her eyes locked on the doll. Then on Janelle. Then back again. Her lips pressed together, then trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but something else. A spark of understanding. Then, slowly, her hand lifted. She took the doll. Edward watched, stunned once more. He had replaced dozens of dolls over the years, ordering the same model whenever one showed signs of wear. But Grace had never reacted like this. Not to the doll, and certainly not to the person giving it. Janelle didn't say anything else. She just smiled, remaining at Grace's level for a few more seconds before standing up and returning to her duties. Grace held the doll tightly, the newly stitched side tucked safely against her chest. And then, a miracle in miniature. Her lips curved. Just a little. Barely there. But unmistakable. Not a full smile, not a giggle, but a tentative, wavering line of joy that had not visited her face in a very long time. Edward saw it. His chest tightened in the best way. For a moment, he didn't feel like a CEO, or a widower, or a man chasing cures across continents. He felt like a father. One who had just been given the tiniest glimpse of his daughter's heart, not through words, but through thread, through silence, and through the quiet power of being seen. It started with a phone held too high, a moment captured without consent. A customer sitting 2 booths away had taken a short video, 20 seconds, no sound, just a frame of a waitress kneeling beside a disabled girl, her arms wrapped around her. The caption posted later that evening read, "Diner or therapy center?" Hard to tell these days. Within hours, the post had picked up traction on social media. Comments flooded in, some praising the tenderness, others ridiculing it. People argued in threads about boundaries, professionalism, and the line between compassion and overstepping. It didn't matter that no one in the video looked uncomfortable. Online, perception ruled over truth. By the next morning, the diner's manager, a practical woman who rarely got involved in drama, had made a decision. She wasn't angry with Janelle. In fact, she thought the girl meant well. But the attention made her nervous. Negative press could hurt the place, especially in a small town. She pulled Janelle aside after her shift and said, carefully but firmly, "I think it's best if we move you to evenings. Just until things settle down." Janelle didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just nodded. That afternoon, she walked home slower than usual, the ache in her chest sharper than any physical fatigue. She hadn't done anything wrong, she knew that. But in a world obsessed with optics, even a hug could be twisted into something inappropriate. She thought about Grace's eyes, the way they lit up when she returned the doll. She wondered if the little girl would notice she wasn't there. She had no idea how deeply that absence would be felt. 2 days later, Edward and Grace returned to the diner. Same time. Same table. But something was wrong the moment they walked in. Grace shifted uncomfortably in his arms. Her head turned from side to side, scanning, searching. Edward seated her carefully and placed the doll, the one Janelle had mended, into her lap. But Grace didn't hold it the way she used to. She let it slide to her side. He ordered her usual, soft scrambled eggs, sliced strawberries, and warm milk. She didn't touch a bite. Instead, she stared at the entrance, unmoving, unblinking. Edward asked the new waitress if Janelle was working. "Evenings now," she said without much thought. He nodded, said nothing more, and turned back to Grace. But she had already begun to retreat. By the time the food arrived, she was slouched in her seat, her face blank. No flinch, no frown, just stillness. Too still. He tried everything, coaxing her with a spoon, placing the doll back into her hand, even whispering songs they used to hum together during her better days. Nothing worked. By the time they got home, Edward's unease had turned into dread. He called their private nurse, who arrived within the hour. Grace didn't react to her presence. No response to touch, to name, to any of the calming techniques that usually helped. The nurse's face grew tight with concern. "I think she's shut down again," she said. "Regression like this usually has a trigger. Has anything changed?" Edward almost scoffed. Everything had changed. And yet nothing had, not on paper, not in reports. Just one missing piece. Just one waitress who wasn't there to kneel, to smile, to offer a soft voice when Grace needed it most. He stood in the hallway outside Grace's room, listening to the shallow sound of her breathing as she lay in bed, eyes open but focused on nothing. For the first time in years, Edward Monroe, the man who always had a solution, didn't know what to do. And for the first time, he allowed himself to admit it hurt. It took Edward 3 phone calls and 1 favor from a former senator to find her schedule. Janelle Brooks had been moved to the evening shift, quietly tucked away from the lunch hour regulars and social media scrutiny. She never complained. She showed up on time, worked hard, and left quietly. Most nights, she closed alone, sweeping under booths and wiping down tables long after the last slice of pie had been served. That's where Edward found her. On a Thursday night, well past closing, the lights dimmed low except for the glow of the open sign that hadn't yet been switched off. She didn't notice him at first. Her back was to the door, her hands working a rag along the countertop with methodical care. She wore her hair tied up, her uniform a little wrinkled from the long shift. There was something tired in the way her shoulders slumped, not physically, but emotionally. As if she was carrying something she hadn't named. Edward stood there for a moment, unsure of how to begin. This wasn't a business meeting. There were no contracts to sign, no metrics to track. This was different. This was personal. He cleared his throat. She turned, startled, then straightened slightly when she saw who it was. "Mr. Monroe?" Her voice was cautious, but not unkind. "Is everything all right?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked slowly to a booth in the corner and sat down, not like a man used to being served, but like someone who had come to ask for something. "I didn't come here for food," he said softly, folding his hands on the table. "I came to ask you a question." She set the rag down and approached, her brow furrowed. "I'm listening," she said. Edward looked down for a second, as if gathering courage. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual certainty. It trembled, just slightly. "I don't need you to serve tables. I need you to help me understand something I've failed to see for years." He paused, meeting her eyes. "I need you to help me understand when my daughter learned how to love. Because I didn't notice it. And you did." Janelle blinked, stunned. "I'm not a therapist," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm here." He leaned forward, his expression softening. "For years, I've poured millions into treatments, centers, top-tier experts. But none of them ever made Grace reach out. None of them made her smile. You did. Not by trying to fix her. Just by being human." Janelle didn't speak. Her eyes glistened, not with pride, but with the weight of knowing someone had finally seen her, not as a mistake, not as a distraction, but as someone who mattered. Edward continued. "I'm planning to fund a new emotional therapy center. One that doesn't start with charts or machines. One that starts with presence, with care." He swallowed. "But I can't build it with engineers and consultants alone. I need a heart. I need someone who understands what it means to listen, without needing to speak." Janelle's hands trembled slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You want me to help design it?" "I want you to help lead it," he said. She laughed once, softly, a sound of disbelief, not amusement. "You want a waitress with unfinished coursework in child development to lead your project?" "I want the woman who saw my daughter when no one else did," Edward replied. Silence stretched between them for a beat. Then Janelle looked away, her voice barely audible. "What if I mess it up?" Edward smiled gently. "Then we mess it up together. But at least this time, we'll be trying for the right reasons." 2 months later, beneath a pale spring sky, a new building stood at the edge of a quiet park in Burlington. Clean lines, wide windows, and a sign out front that simply read, "The Silent Hug Project." There were no balloons, no flashing lights, no loudspeakers. This opening was not for show. It was for something deeper. Inside, the rooms were painted in soft earth tones, filled with natural light and open space. No harsh beeps, no sterile machines. Just a quiet hum of possibility. It didn't look like a traditional therapy center, because it wasn't one. It was a place where children who couldn't always speak could still be heard. At the heart of the center was a program Janelle Brooks had helped design from the ground up, one rooted in touch, in stillness, in what she called communication through holding. She now stood at the helm of the Hug Communication Program, leading a team of counselors, volunteers, and parents through sessions that began not with questions, but with open arms. The philosophy was simple. Sometimes, the safest language is silence, and the most powerful tool is presence. Word had spread quietly but steadily. Families drove in from neighboring towns. Some children came in wheelchairs, others with headphones over their ears. Many arrived guarded, unsure. But all were met with warmth, not therapy as they knew it, but connection without pressure. On the morning of the center's opening ceremony, folding chairs were set up in a semicircle under a canopy of trees. A soft breeze fluttered through the leaves as staff, families, and guests gathered to witness something that had once seemed impossible. Grace Monroe sat at the center of the stage, dressed in a soft yellow dress, her favorite stuffed bear nestled in her lap. Her hair had been brushed gently to the side, and a small pink ribbon adorned one side. Her wheelchair was decorated with hand-painted flowers done by some of the other children at the center. She didn't speak, didn't wave, but her eyes moved. She scanned the crowd slowly, peacefully. There was no panic, no stiffness. Just presence. Behind her, Edward Monroe stood quietly, his hands folded, no longer the powerful figure in a suit but a father humbled by the journey he had not chosen, but had finally learned to walk. A soft melody began to play, a composition written by one of the therapists, designed not to stimulate but to soothe. Notes drifted into the morning air like petals. Janelle stepped forward. She wasn't holding a speech. She wasn't wearing anything fancy, just a pale blouse and simple flats. She didn't walk with purpose. She walked with calm. And when she reached Grace, she didn't turn to the audience. She didn't acknowledge the cameras or the applause. She knelt. And then, just like that first day in the diner, she opened her arms and gently, without hesitation, embraced the girl. No fanfare. No performance. Just the same quiet, steady hug that had changed everything. This time, Grace didn't just remain still. She moved. Her right hand reached for Janelle's, and then with almost unbearable tenderness, her head tilted forward, and rested against Janelle's chest. Before a crowd of dozens. Before the lens of every news outlet in the state. For the first time in her life, Grace initiated contact. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't need to. There was something sacred in the silence. Edward, standing off to the side, felt his breath catch. He had given speeches on stages bigger than this, to investors, to governments. He had bowed before royalty, shaken hands with presidents. But in this moment, he bowed his head, not in pride, but in reverence. Not for a success story, but for a little girl's quiet answer to a world that finally chose to listen. In a world that often moves too fast and speaks too loudly, this story reminds us that the most powerful language may not be words, but presence. For older generations who have lived through decades of change, this truth resonates deeply. Healing doesn't always come from medicine or modern methods. Sometimes, it begins with a quiet hug, a listening heart, and the courage to slow down and truly see another soul. Edward Monroe spent a lifetime building solutions, but it wasn't until he paused, and allowed someone humble, someone unseen, to reach his daughter, that transformation began. Janelle didn't have a degree or prestige. What she had was something more rare, compassion without condition. This story is a gentle call to action for all of us. Never underestimate the quiet things. A soft word. A steady hand. A willingness to hold space for someone's pain. Especially in our later years, we carry the wisdom to know, these are the gestures that linger. So the next time life asks for an answer, maybe try silence. Maybe try presence. Maybe just hold someone. That might be all they need to find their way home. If you believe that a well-timed hug can be its own language, a language for hearts that can't always speak, then leave a like for the woman who wasn't afraid to hold a silent child, and was answered not with words, but with a gentle stillness that said everything. And don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. 4 more healing stories that remind us. Sometimes the quietest moments are the ones that change everything. We'll see you next time.